Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. It's been a while since I made a video, and if you want to know what I've been up to, please do add me on LinkedIn, where I've been posting all sorts of updates about my exploits as a full-time developer. Actually, a job with having two full-time development jobs at the moment. So what I want to do today is talk about more React hooks. I want to talk about the useContext hook and the useReducer hook. So what I have here is a very basic React project, or just a shell of a project. So here I have my index.html with the basic CDN links here. So here's the React CDN. Then we have the Babel CDN. Then we have the link. Well, here's the Babel CDN, or both of these are Babel. And then here's a link to our JS file. Actually, this is, which makes use of Babel to translate. Cool. So just so that way, if you don't know how to set this up before, you know the idea. Although this is not a beginner React video, if you haven't seen the rest of my React videos, it's probably good to watch that first. And then here's our index.js file, which just has our React DOM render, which injects an app component into our DOM. So let's first start off by creating that app component. So const app equals props, and then this, and somewhere we're going to return some JSX. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this 3 times, because I want to have 3 components. So we're going to call this child, and this grandchild. And again, inside app, all we're going to render is child. Inside child, all we're going to render is grandchild. And in grandchild, we're going to say h1 hello world. Cool. So let's see here. And let's just make sure there's no syntax errors before we do our first run. So again, theoretically, we're going to have the app component, which is rendered onto our screen. But the app component basically renders the child component, which then renders the grandchild component, which then renders hello world. Okay, so I'm going to hit save on that. Now we need to run this. So I need to run my terminal and make my way to that folder. So that's going to be cd react, and then cd useReducer. That's the tutorial running. And then here I'm going to run light server. So if you have installed light server on your system, just npm install g flag for global light server, or you can just do npm I light server and just install it locally. And then light server will run, so that way my project can be visible, because Babel needs a server to do its Babel translating thing. So let's give it a second for it to start queuing everything up, and then let me bring over the browser window. And let's see here, and there it goes. There we see hello world. So let's examine that real quick. So if you don't have the React developer tools, you download them, and then usually what would happen is you would head over to here to components, and we can see we have the app component, and inside the app component we have the child component, and we have the grandchild component, and I can go and inspect any of their children and their props and all that stuff in here. Very nice, very useful. Okay, so now that we have it all set up, the question is, what are we trying to learn here? Okay, we want to learn about passing down state. Okay, and I've talked about this before with like class components using context and whatnot. And context exists in function components as a hook. So we're going to talk about that. But also, what used to happen is that if you had a lot of state in your project, going down very deep in your component ladder, you would use this external library called Redux. And you would store all your data in what's called a Redux store, which is essentially the sort of central repository of data. App level state in a sense. and then you would pass down this function called the reducer around your function, and the reducer would basically get a flag, get an action from whenever you use it that would tell it what to do, and then you would have this reducer function that could either be a bunch of if statements or a bunch of a switch statement that would take that action and then decide based on the action what to do and update the state appropriately. That's essentially, but the thing with Redux is you'd end up typing out all this boilerplate code just to get it set up, and it would take like a while just to do that, and was only really worth it if you had a lot of state. But with the useReducer hook, you get that functionality without all the boilerplate. And then Redux has come out with its own hooks to simplify its own process, but this is built in, so why not use it? Okay, so first things first, let's build out the useReducer function. So the way it works, so let's say, let's do it from the app component. It doesn't have to be, you could do it anywhere. Const, and then basically you're going to get two things from your useReducer hook. Okay. Okay, so you're going to get your initial state. So we're going to call this our, we'll call this, yeah, just call this state. And you're going to get your dispatch. You have to call them that? No, but this makes it easier to know what I'm talking about. State and dispatch. And again, you can create multiples of these. You don't have to do it all in one state like you would with Redux or with using a class component. So state dispatch equals, and then here we're going to use React.useReducer, and then here you're going to pass in your reducer function, which we haven't defined yet, and you're going to pass in your initial state, which we haven't defined yet. Okay, so that's essentially the format for initiating the reducer. Okay, now the next thing we need to do is define our initial state, which should be just as easy as just doing this. Const initial state, and we'll just define it as an empty object for now. Okay. Oh, we'll just say, we'll give it just a couple basic number 1. Okay, we're just going to play with that. And cool. Save. Cool. Now we need to set up our reducer. So let's do that. Oop, I opened up that site. Okay. And again, we need to define our reducer. So our reducer is going to take 2 parameters. Const reducer, because we're going to use it, we have to name it the same way we do it here, so actually I have to change this to initial state, so that way it all matches up here. And the reducer takes 2 parameters. State, so we're gonna, it's always going to be able to get, it's always going to get the current state of this, and it's always going to get your action, which you'll see what that is in a bit. Okay, and then what we do here is we can define what happens whenever that reducer function gets used. And you can do however you want, but sort of a standard way of doing it is doing a switch statement. So what you do is you do something like this, switch, and then you do action, and then based on the action, several possibilities. We'll just do a basic example where there's a case for add. Okay, and that was basically what's going to happen. And then what happens is it's going to return the new state. So whatever it returns becomes the new value of state. So I want it to return the same state. So what I will do is I'll say whatever initial state is at the moment, or state is at the moment. So we're going to use a spread operator, but we want the property number to equal whatever number is plus 1. Or we can even just do that. Just do it as number plus 1 to be more semantic. Okay, so again, I'm spread operator to make sure that way if there's other stuff in state that's accessible. And then here we're changing the property number plus 1. And then, okay, you always want to prevent breakthroughs, so you're going to put a break thing there. And then let me just space this out a little bit more so it's a little bit clear. Then we can do case subtract. Okay, and then return, same idea. So I can just copy and paste this, honestly. Control C, Control O. There we go, and except now it's going to be number -1. So essentially what's going to happen is that and then just in case, default. Oh, and I got to put the colon here too. Default, return the state as it is, so state. So basically what this does is that whenever this function is going to run, we're going to receive an action. And it's going to see if this action matches any of these words, and then do the appropriate action. Cool. So what we're going to do is up here in our grandchild component, so let me just save that so far. Okay, and right now that function doesn't do anything, but let's take a look at our thing over here. Just wait for it to load. Let's take a look at our console. Yep, let's see here. What is it complaining about? Return. It's complaining about our default. Oh, that's supposed to be curly brackets. There we go. Save. And let's let that re-render for a moment. Cool. So right now it still does the same thing, but let's take a look at it in the components thing. So now if we take a look at app, we see it does have a reducer. We see the reducer hook, which is currently storing the number 1. And again, child and grandchild still have no. Now, there's a couple different ways I can make use of this. I could do prop drilling, yay, which means I'd have to do this. So I'd have to then first pass down, so we'll just say we'll make a prop called reducer equals reducer on the child. So I have to pass it down once, and now it's in our child component as a prop, but I want to pass it down to grandchild, so I want to pass it as a prop again. So here we go, there it is again, except now it's going to be props.reducer because it's the props of the child. And now I should be able to use it here. And now what I want to do is create a couple buttons. And instead here, we're going to show, we're going to have to pass down the number as well. Okay, so we'll come back to that. Okay, boom, 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 boom. Or I can just put the number up here. Let's just do that. Keep life simple today. So let me make a fragment. So react.fragment. So that way it doesn't complain about having too many top level children or tags. And then what I want to do here is we're going to put the number. State dot number. Because the object is called state, because that's what we defined it as. Over here, we're calling it technically not there here. So we have this variable called state, which has a variable called number in it. I could call it from initial state, but initial state doesn't necessarily change. It's the state that's going to be changing every time we use the dispatch function. So keep that in mind. Okay, so we're going to print the number there. I'm passing down the reducer, but I'm passed it down twice. Okay, now let's make a use of it. So we're going to create two buttons here. So first button, which on click is going to do the following. It's going to just do an inline function. Okay, it's going to pass in the reducer, or it's going to invoke the reducer. One moment. Oh, wait, what did I call it? Let's go back over here. Did I call it reducer? Or did I call it dispatch? Dispatch. So it's going to invoke dispatch. And in dispatch, we are going to pass in an object that describes the action. Or we don't have to pass in an object. Just depends on how you describe it. Okay, so we're going to pass in dispatch and then add. Okay, so that'll just add. And then again, let's just close off this button. So we're going to call this add button. And then let's add a second button. And why is that discolored? Oh. Okay, React dot fragment. This has to be one of the most useful tags. It's just nice to not have to worry about this whole top level div thing. Slash React dot fragment. And then what did I call the other one? Subtract. 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 Okay. Save. And now what's going to happen is that with this function, I can now change state that's actually up above the component tree. So let's see if that all worked out the way we expected it to. So let's let that re-render. Okay, so there's the number 1, and there's our 2 buttons. Now if I add, okay, it's not re-rendering. Let's see here. Let's go to the console. Make sure there's no errors first. Okay, dispatch is not defined. Oh, that's right. It's not dispatch. It's props.dispatch. You can tell I just woke up. So let's hit save. Let that re-render. Yeah, let's try that again. Oh, still a problem. Let's see here. Props.dispatch is not a function. Dispatch is not a function. Let's examine. Let's see here. Oh, wait. Yep, I see what happened. I never passed down dispatch. I passed it down as reducer. So let's go back and fix that. So again, we call the child. We want to call this dispatch. And we want to call this dispatch. I don't want to pass down reducer because then I'm passing down the function without all the connected stuff. Okay, so let's fix that. So we pass it down to the child, and from the child we need to pass it down to the grandchild. Okay, and then again that's going to be props.dispatch. And now we're calling props.dispatch. Save. Goody, good, good. Let's try that again. More errors. Let's see what we did now. Number is not defined. Where did I just write number? Which state number? Oh, I see. This should, I need to make a reference to the original state. So state.number. Because there is no number variable. There is a state object that has a number property inside of it. Okay, and again, I always like to leave, when I make little mistakes like that, I like to leave that in there so that way you can see sort of how I'm reading errors, what approach am I taking to sort of figure out what's wrong. Because most of it's not about getting it right the first time, but it's about being able to solve for what you need more efficiently as you get more practice. And there you go. See, now it works. So if I add, and I can subtract. Very nice. Now the problem is, I had to send this down 2 flights. Picture if you have components that are like 6 levels deep. having to pass that same piece of information 1 down, 2, 3 down, levels down. And this is where context is going to become useful, and the context hook becomes very useful. So now to use the useContext hook, first thing we have to do is we have to define the context. So we don't have to do that inside the component, we can do that outside the component. So we'll just call this const dispatch context equals react dot create context. Okay, react dot create context. And what this does, it creates sort of a store for variables that can be passed around. Great, so now this exists. Okay, it's basically creating like a weird component that you can use to pass data down. So let's save that. Now then what happens is that we need to wrap these components in this. So dispatch context dot provider. So it created this particular component. And the provider, what it does, it just provides the data. Okay, and then we need to actually specify what data it's providing. So value equals, we want to send down the dispatch. You could create an object with all the data that you want to send down everywhere, but you can create as many contexts as you want, because why not? So value dispatch. So we're going to send down dispatch instead. And then I need to get a closing tag, Control C. And we don't need this in the closing tag, but we do need a backslash. And there we go. So now this component is going to be making all the data, anything below it. So child and grandchild now have access to dispatch without me having to pass it as props. So now I can get rid of this as props. Oh, did my thing freeze? I think it did. Give it a moment. Do. Oh, computer. Let's see here, we're still recording, good. Okay, so let's go back over here, or over here. Oh, Atom closed, that was the problem. That's not good. Okay. Okay, so let's see here. We got that all back up and running. So let's go back down here just to recap what we were doing. So we had the dispatch provider, which is now making the variable available to my other components. So now if I go back to child, and let me just make sure I didn't pass it down as props anymore. Yep. Wait, no, still think state that number, that's fine. Child, good, okay. So now let's go back to child. So here's child. Before I was passing down dispatch. I don't need to pass down dispatch anymore because we have our context. And now in grandchild, all I need to do is actually grab that context. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new variable called const dispatch. Okay, and it's going to equal react dot use context. So it's going to take whatever value this context is passing down, and I name the context dispatch context. So I'm going to say, hey, whatever dispatch context provided this component tree, please store it in this variable called dispatch. And since it's just the variable, just the function dispatch, it's just making dispatch available. So now I can just get rid of the props here. And we should be good to go. So save. So basically we skipped having to pass down as props to that middle component, which is really useful if you have like 5 components in between, you know, your destination and your source. So let's take a look, make sure it works. And it works. Okay, so we avoided all that prop drilling. So we have the ability to manipulate state up and down. So I can use dispatch to manipulate the state in any component that's below that app component without having to go pass down the actual state and create all sorts of different use state functions. I can just, use it. And then with context, I can just pass it down wherever I need to pass down the function to. And it makes life a lot easier. Okay, so these are two really, really useful hooks. Okay, that's use dispatch and use context. Okay, basically that's the function component or hooks version of context, and then use dispatch essentially now Redux being built in to React, which is awesome. Okay, so this makes for a great, and you can literally do anything. Okay, you don't have to pass down. So notice here when I did the action, I just passed down a string, but you could pass down an object, an array. So what some people will do, so let's try this. It'll be the last thing and we'll wrap up this video. Instead, what they'll do is they'll do dispatch something like this. They'll say, they'll pass down an object, and they'll have like type add, and then they'll have like payload, a variable they want to use, as 2. Okay, and then I'll just do the same thing here. Control C. Put that inside as the parameter. So we're passing in an object. Type subtract, and we're still going to subtract 2. So now what I can do is this. So now action is an object. So I have to change the switch to action.type. So it's looking at the type of action, and then instead of state number plus 1, we can do state number plus action dot payload, and you can call the variables whatever you want. These are just some very typical terminology. Action dot payload. So now what's going to happen is going to add 2. Okay, and let's just take a look. So now I should be adding 2 every time I click the thing. So 3, 5, 7, 5, 3. Okay, and I could change it to a random number if I wanted to. I could do whatever I want, and I can add more and more to that object. I mean, you don't want to make it too complicated, but you can do that. So you can create very complex state logic and centralize it all into one function called dispatch, which just then does what you want it to do based on what you pass in as an action. And then again, you can distribute that dispatch action fairly easily using the context function, which is pretty cool. So I'll leave it at that. You guys have a great day and enjoy.